Hey guys, and welcome back. Now, in the previous nugget, we had talked about Grub Legacy, and we did mention, and I suppose the name will give you a little bit of a hint, that Grub Legacy is legacy and it's not the most updated version. We now have Grub2, and this is really what we're going to be seeing on modern Linux-based systems. Now, the reason why is that it does bring with it several improvements. One of the improvements it brings is the fact that it has UUID support, which makes things much easier, and it handles our grub configuration file and the generation of that configuration file in a more programmatic way. Simply put, Grub2 just is easier to use and much better designed. Now, with respect to Grub2, we do have some particular locations that we do want to be aware of. Now, the first location we want to check out is in the etc directory and in the grub.d directory within that. What you're going to find within this directory right here are a whole bunch of templates. And another very important file is also within the etc directory, but it's going to be etc default /grub. Now, one thing to note here is that see this file right here in conjunction with the templates and the etc grub.d directory, they are actually used together to generate a grub.cfg file. So with the grub legacy, you would just go in and modify the grub.cfg file directly. In this case here, we do not modify the grub.cfg itself. If we want to make changes to what will ultimately be our grub configuration file, we want to do it via modification of those templates within the etc grub.d directory or the etc default grub file, which contains some very particular settings. So let me actually show you the templates as well as our settings file that will be used to generate this grub configuration file. Okay, so if we go in to the etc directory and then into grub.d, if we do an ls, we're actually going to see these configuration template files. Now, we can actually go in and look at these if we so choose. Let's go into maybe say Debian theme, so 05, and hit enter. And we can see what we have in here. This is ultimately a long bash script. Okay, so if we escape out, notice we have these custom templates. Now, these are the files we would like to be editing if we want to create some custom menu entries. Remember, we talked about the grub menu file earlier on in the previous nuggets. If we want to generate new entries, we could do so by amending to this custom file right here, this custom template, so to speak. Now, this is just one location that we have to check. Like I say, we also want to be looking at the default directory. And within here, we will have this grub file. Okay, so let me go in here. So nano grub. And we can see here, this is a settings file. And like I say, this is going to be used in conjunction with the templates we see in the etc grub.d directory. Now, what we're actually looking at here is not too dissimilar to what we talked about in the previous nuggets. Remember, we talked about a default value with respect to the options within our grub menu, the 0 being the option at the very top. And if we happen to change this to the number 1, that would mean we were choosing the second from the top. This is the same type of deal, this time though, for Grub2. So we use the grub_default option. And if we want to automatically select the option at the top, once that timer has elapsed, we would leave that value at the value 0. However, if we wanted to choose the second from the top by default once the timer elapses, we would change that to the value 1, so on and so forth. Now, the next value we can see here is the grub timeout style. We have the value hidden. This is similar to what we saw before when we talked about the hidden menu option with respect to the grub legacy. When we have the grub timeout style set to hidden, the title menu is not going to be displayed during the actual timeout countdown. Now, the grub timeout we have right here. Again, we can change this value if we so choose. This is how many seconds should we wait before we actually boot to the default. Now, right now we have the value at 0, which means that we're not going to wait at all. If we wanted to modify this, we could change this to 5, which would be 5 seconds, or 30, which would be 30 seconds. Or if we so choose, we could actually set the value to -1. Now what this would actually mean is that we would wait forever. We would actually not count down and then load in a default option. Instead, we would actually require that the user is explicit and chooses the option, because quite simply, we would just wait and wait and wait until they did so. Now we can see some other options here. We can see Grub command line Linux. This is if we want to pass in additional parameters to the kernel, such as the RHGB option that we talked about in the previous nugget, which would be the Red Hat graphical boot. And if we wanted to use this with the quiet option, we could also pass in the value quiet. And we can also see the Grub command line Linux default. And as we can see here, we're passing the values quiet and splash. So quiet to suppress the output, splash to actually get that splash menu. Now, like I say, this settings file in conjunction with the templates found in our grub.d directory is going to allow us to generate this grub.cfg config file. Now, as it stands right now, if I just do a clear and I go to my boot directory, we do an ls, I have this directory here called grub. Now, some distributions may actually have a directory called grub2, but on my Ubuntu machine or my Xubuntu machine, this directory is just called grub. Now, within here, this is where the grub.cfg file is going to be located. So if I actually go in and look at this file right here, notice this file looks much different from the configuration file I talked about in the previous nuggets. This is much more programmatic, and like I say, it's going to be pulling from what we find within that grub.d directory and the settings in our etc default grub file. Now, what if we wanted to change this grub.cfg file, i.e. we wanted to modify some of the values within this directory here, our configuration templates, or we wanted to modify the actual settings within this file right here? How would we actually generate that new file? Well, let me show you what I can do here. Okay, so like we can see here, we do have this grub configuration file. If we wanted though to generate a new configuration file from our templates and from our settings file, how could we do such a thing? Well, first we would make a modification that we wanted to implement either within one of our template files right here, or alternatively, we could go into our settings file right here. So let's say I would change the grub default value from 0 to 1. And maybe the timeout will change it to 5 seconds. So I'll save this and I'll push X. So now what I will do is I will actually go to my boot menu. So here we are. And I have a command that I can use to generate this configuration file. Now be careful. This command is actually different if you're using a Debian-based system or a Red Hat-based system. If we are using a Debian-based system, the command is going to be grub-mkconfig. And if you're on a Red Hat-based system, that would actually be grub2-mkconfig. But like I say, I happen to be on Ubuntu, which is derived from Debian, so I will use grub-mkconfig. And I'll just say -o to specify the output file that I'm going to generate. And I'll just call this my new grub stuff.cfg. And if I hit enter now, nothing is going to happen because I have to run this as root, of course. So I'll try this again. And now we're going to generate this new configuration file. If I do an ls, we can see here, we have now generated this new file here, again pulling from those two different locations. So now I could go in and have a look at this file that I have generated. We can see all this programmatic stuff has been automatically generated. Okay, let's go back. And what I would do is I would actually move this file into the same directory as my grub configuration file, which is in this directory here. This might be grub2 for you. Okay, so I've moved it in. I go into this directory. Now we can see the grub configuration file and my newly generated one. Ultimately, I would back this one up and I would rename this one, the new one, grub.cfg. And if I wanted to install this, I could use my grub install command and then specify the location of where I want to install this. Now, one thing I really do want to get to though, and what I'll do is I'll actually terminate my SSH session right here, and I'll just go directly to my virtual machine. Now what I'm going to do here is to restart my system, and I'm going to try to access the grub menu. Now depending on whatever system you're using, the way you do this may vary. On my Windows machine, the key that I'm going to press is the escape key. you might be on a system whereby you might have to press the shift key. So if you're having trouble doing this, like I say, there may be some variation. You may have to do a little bit of Googling to get the correct key for your system. So what I will do here is I'll press restart, and I'll press restart and I'll hit the escape key. So now this brings me to this menu right here, okay? Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to choose advanced options for Ubuntu and click this. Now if I try to full screen this, it's not going to show the full screen, unfortunately. So I'm just going to change the view to scaled mode, so it might look a little bit pixelated. I do apologize. Now down the bottom here, we can see we have these different options. If I press the letter C, this is going to bring me into a command line interface. And as we can see here, this is a minimal bash-like interface. And this is a prompt you may be presented with if you happen to have a severe issue on your machine. Now, if I do the command ls, we're actually going to see information relating to our disk. So I can see HD0 here. That denotes the first disk. MS-DOS 5. This is actually my partition information. This is going to be SDA5, so to speak. This happens to be where my file system is mounted, and this part here, this is where my boot is mounted. So if I actually happen to do ls and I select my root file system, so I'll do HD, and I can select MS-DOS 5, but I can just select the value 5, okay? If I hit enter here, it tells me the file system type, ext, we get the UUID, as well as some basic partition information. Now, if I happen to choose the / for the root file system, watch what happens. See this? This is just like what we see on our Linux-based system. Here are all of our folders. See this? Lost and found, boot, swap file, say for example, home. So if I arrow up and I choose home, we can see the IPv0 folder, so I can go into IPv0. We can see all my downloads and desktop folders, so on and so forth. So we can still navigate our file system. Now you may recall when we talked about our Grub legacy configuration file, let me just bring this back up. Do you remember these settings here? Root, kernel, initrd? Well, we want to ultimately do a similar thing right here, but there is a little bit of variation. One thing to note here is that this option here, kernel, this is going to look a little bit different. When we're using Grub2, the value is going to be the word Linux, not the word kernel. So I'm going to say set root and give it a particular value. But as opposed to saying set kernel, I'm going to say Linux and then give the name of the kernel as well as where the root file system should be mounted. Whereas the initrd value, this is going to be the exact same. So the only real variation here is going to be this value here. Kernel will be instead the word Linux. So if we want to see what our values are right now, we can just type the command set, and this will show everything that we have already set. So we can see here, the root right here is at HD0 MS-DOS 5. That is the disk and the partition. And if we actually want to be able to see this a little bit better, I will just set the pager value to 1. And I'll now say set. Now I can just spacebar down so we can see the very top and hit spacebar to scroll down. Okay, so let's actually type in these three values, the root value, the Linux value, as well as the initrd value. So I'll just say set root equal to, and I'll just say HD0. And I can say MS-DOS 5, but I'll just leave it at 5. So if I hit enter, that would be that value set. Now, like I say, I'm actually not changing any particular values. The values I have happen to be working. I'm just showing how you could actually change these values if you needed to. Now, like I say, we have to specify where the kernel is and where we should mount the root file system. We're not going to use the command kernel. Instead, we're going to use the command Linux. Now, whereabouts is the kernel image found? It's found within the boot directory. And all the images are going to start with vmlin. So if I do vmlim and hit tab, we're going to see all the options. The one that I'm going to choose is the one I'm already using right now, which is vmlinux 513028. And I can tab this out. And I have to specify where the root file system is going to be. I'm going to say root is equal to /dev /SDA5. So if I hit enter here, that is going to set that value. The third value is going to be the initrd value. Now remember, just like we talked about, the version number here has to match. Okay, so 513028, I have to use the same initrd image. So I'll say initrd boot, and the image will be initrd, and I can hit tab. We can see I have 511027. That is not the one I want. I wanted to match this one right here. So 513028, which is this one right here. So I will say 5.13. I can tab this out and hit enter. So that is my three values now set. My root value, my Linux value, and my initrd value. I will just hit boot, and now it should begin booting up. And if you just give it a minute, I'm now able to log in to my machine. So I'll type in my username and then my password, and there we go. So I can just log in, and now I have full access back to my system. I can do a uname-r. We can see this is the kernel I had. I didn't actually change anything. Go into cd boot, do an ls, and we can see here this was the image I used for the kernel, and correspondingly this was the image I used for my initrd. Again, notice that the numbers happen to match, 513028 and 513028 matching correctly. So clearly I happen to force myself into the Grub menu, but if you happen to find yourself in that unfortunate situation where you try to boot up and it automatically loads in, you know the settings that you can use to try to boot back into your system. You want to specify your Linux value pointing to the correct kernel image, as well as the correct corresponding initrd image. Once you do that, you can use the boot command, and hopefully, if all is successful, you should be able to boot back into your machine. Okay, dokes, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.